here in Human Services. Cassie Schraft is an LPC, and Lydia Hager is contracted through our department. We consider her part of our team as well. And they both have specific training in some of these modalities, as well as having information just through their professional experience and education about some others. So they're going to provide a bit of an overview, and I'm sure we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end as well. And you can also use your chat if you want to put questions in there. Rebecca and I will try to keep an eye on that. So with that, I will let the two of them take it away. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Corey. So I am going to start. I'm Lydia. I maybe know a couple of you, but how I wanted to start today was just because I don't know everyone, if you guys could just put what your professional role is in the chat, just so I know who I'm talking to, so then I could just kind of tailor it just a little bit. And I'll just take a look at that, and I'll start sharing my screen here. Okay. Can you guys see that? Okay, let me start this from the beginning. Everything's in the way. Well, can you guys see? Is that okay? Does that work for you? Okay, cool. All right, so I just wanted to start with a brief trauma definition. I know we all kind of know what this is, but just to kind of give us a jumping off point. So obviously it's an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, death, severe injury, rape, or natural disaster. I mean, these are the kind of big ideas when we think of a trauma. Can also result as an adult's experience to violence in the home, family, neighborhood, and the neighborhood violence, civil unrest. I'm going to talk about that a little bit actually further on. And this, I mean, emergency personnel, that's a major population that's affected. So just to give us a little background there. So I have physiology here, and I'm going to go into that a little bit. I know that's not the actual trauma modality, but the reason I asked you for your professions is because you might notice what's going on physiologically with a person before you would ever know what their trauma event was. So I kind of wanted to go into that a little bit first. So that's what I'll go here. And I know some of this is review. And if anybody is adding any questions, just talk over me, interrupt. So how trauma is created. So, you know, we know fight or flight or freeze. So we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, right, that's the constricted blood vessels. That's where we're like, oh my gosh, something is going on. I need to respond. And this is biology. We're born with this. This is what we get. And the parasympathetic calms us down. It gives us that ability to relax. So when we are confronted with trauma, the threat stress response system is activated. So that leads me into what is a threat. Okay. And so this is what you may all notice, right? So not feeling successful or achieving at someone or achieving at something. So I think typically we wouldn't think this as a threat, but depending on what kind of associations have been made previously to an older trauma, that can seem as a threat. I'm not good enough, feeling insecure, appearing not competent to others. So fear and worrisomes, those kinds of things can be a threat to us, depending on what our past traumas have been. So a trauma response can be treated as a trauma in these modalities. So in EMDR, in prolonged exposure therapy, in brain spotting. So these, you know, unmet basic human needs, belonging to a group, having the power to influence someone's world or environment, all of those things can be molded into a threat. So I just kind of wanted to take us out of that box that a threat is someone saying, I want to kill you, or someone saying, I'm gonna hurt you. A threat can be much wider. And instead of like being so narrow in that, I just kind of wanted to open that up a little bit, that can come in for folks. Okay. All right, let's see here. So, oops. Okay. So fears or worrisome fantasies. So an example of this, so like, let's take someone who, someone who came in to see me, and the woman was raped, and that is her primary trauma. And now she's applying for this new job, and she's like, oh my gosh, what are they going to be thinking about me? Okay, so this fears and this worrisome fantasies become an association with the trauma event. So they're like two things, they're now connected. So I think another way to explain that, so what would be another word? Lid, I'll take my name. Sometimes people call me Lid instead of Lydia. And so the association for the word lid, like let's say in my dad's brain, could be a lid that you put on a pot, or a lid like me, his daughter. Okay, so that's an association. So even though they're very different things, just like the rape and the new job, that association has been made. So that is why I'm starting off talking about some of these things, these fears and these worrisome fantasies, because they can directly relate to that original trauma. I hope that makes sense so far. Okay, Corey's nodding yes. So adaptation. So this is a little bit more in depth. I'm not going to spend too much time here. So adaptation is the action or process of adapting, right? We're just adjusting. So that person, that woman who was raped, she's going to adjust. She's going to go into that job, and she may not be as full as into herself and into who she was before, but she's going to adapt, right? And then mitigation, that can be the opposite. So this could be provoking a fight before tensions get too high. So you're mitigating the bad that could happen before it does. You're taking it away, and that may be adaptive, or that may be maladaptive. And again, so the reason we're talking about this is because those adaptive or maladaptive mitigation strategies by the client might be what you all see first. So that might be the drug use, or that might be a fight, that might be a domestic charge, could be any number of things. So that can help you work backwards to understand that a referral to, a trauma counselor might be a good idea. Okay. So traumagenesis, I don't know if I just kind of wanted to highlight some things that maybe might not be like really known. So it's the progression of overreacting the body's threat stress response system. That's where adaptation and mitigation live, that interrupt the normal developmental process of healing oneself in a trauma experience. And sympathetic dominant, right? So like so in this woman who has been raped, her stimuli goes, her stimuli response is way up here, and she lives in this sympathetic dominant kind of lifestyle where she's overly stimulated. Okay, and so this is just a little chart, but we can move on from these, and I can always send this out too. It just kind of gets a lot into the nitty gritty of those things. In this, I think this is helpful. It's just saying that executive functioning is suppressed, right? So that new job, maybe parts of that executive functioning that she may have needed could have been suppressed, even though that association, is wildly different. Those associations create pathways for things to go wrong. Of course, they can obviously go the other way. They can adapt. But the reason we're here is because sometimes those things go wrong. Okay. And then we know PTSD, increased activation of the amygdala, the frontal lobes, that's where the higher reasoning is, that's where judgment, control, those kinds of things are, that heightened fear and anxiety. I think we, all know what trauma is, PTSD. So bigotry and trauma, this is one of those other things that I wanted to briefly touch on. Just to bring forward now, that might be a little bit more present in our society, especially like I think about, some family in big cities and, those kinds of things. And so I was actually introduced to bigotry and trauma, or bigotry versus trauma, from one of the doctors I work with in my school. And she posed the question, is it bigotry or is it trauma? Or is it both? So there's just a couple of examples there, but I didn't want to get too much into it. But again, this is one of those things that can be noticed by folks, that's just another path that can kind of lead back to that trauma stuff. All right, let's see. I think I have one more on bigotry and trauma here. Insidious trauma. So marginalization, objectification, dehumanization, intimidation, all of those kinds of things that make someone feel less than, right? So that may not necessarily be defined as the trauma in the DSM-5, but those are kind of trauma things. So the professor I worked with, she was a firefighter for years. She's a Black woman. And so these are some of the examples she gave. So insufficient instruction because she was a woman. They didn't want to talk to her. Coworker hostility. She said she was even actually left in a burning building because she's like, you're the chick and we're not going to help you. So just kind of opening our gaze a little bit here. And then, of course, moral injury. It's a wound of the conscious. Moral injury just means that we, I think the example, often goes back to veterans because that's where the research started. The example of the man who was given orders, to shoot the child with the backpack on, and, his value of valuing life and humanity, but he also values his job, the military. Those two values clearly collided there. And then later he found out that the kid just had a backpack of candy. And so now he has to live with that for the rest of his life. So that is a wound of the conscious. That's a moral injury. So just something else to be looking for when we're thinking about who would we refer to these trauma modalities. Okay, so now we're getting to EMDR. So EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And I'll be honest, I'm a little biased here. I do EMDR, so I probably have more slides on EMDR than the other things, but we can always circle back around to any of them. And I just love this story. So Francine Shapiro, PhD psychology student in 1987, she was taking a walk in the park. And she realized that when she was on her walk, some of her disturbing thoughts kind of dissipated. And she started to do more research with that. She tried it with her family and her friends. And she realized that when you're walking and your vision crosses the midline of your brain and back and forth, that helped reduce some of that icky stuff that she was feeling. So she started it, and it was originally just EMD, eye movement desensitization, because the reprocessing came in later. So that is how it began. And EMDR was so, what is the word I'm looking for? It was really disputed. People were like, this is bananas, this doesn't work. And so that actually helped EMDR, because now that is one of the most researched trauma modalities. So it didn't prove it wrong, it proved it right. So now we have all this information, all this research that just simply supports it instead of discredited it. So EMDR is an adaptive information processing treatment. So we just say AIP for short. So this points that much of the psychopathology is due to the maladaptive encoding. Okay, so maladaptive encoding, meaning all of that stuff, that all of those threats that were listed on the previous slide, all this maladaptive encoding or incomplete processing. So a trauma happened and it was too big, too much for our body to process. So either of those things. And it's having a adverse, and it's creating PTSD, and it's providing negative stuff in this person's life. Okay, so EMDR allows that to be reversed. Okay, so inclusive to EMDR, so let me see. So much for reading off what I typed. Okay, so EMDR is inclusive to all of these approaches. I think at some point now, unless we were one of the original, creators like Freud or something like that, that most treatments are inclusive to other treatments that have already happened. So it has a psychodynamic approach because there is a free association kind of component to it. It can certainly promote catharsis, abreactions, which is very psychodynamic. So an abreaction is a physical reaction to something that the person is processing internally. So my example is, I've had this happen twice. I've had clients who have actually physically thrown up in my office because it's like it's leaving the body. And that's not a bad thing, but that's just an abreaction. So that also happens in EMDR, just as it does the psychodynamic approach. A lot of symbolism here, family of origin, especially depending on the trauma. So a behavioral, learning change, generalizations, conditioned responses. There's a lot of conditioning in EMDR. It's as if you're processing, but then the reprocessing part of EMDR, the reprocessing, that is about the installation of good stuff that happens. So it has all these other approaches. I won't spend too much time getting into here, but it's birthed from a lot of other very sustained approaches in the field. Okay. Will EMDR change who I am? I often get asked that. I think because EMDR is a little bit mysterious. It's like you ask me to, either stare at this light thing that make my eyes go back and forth, or I have to hold on to these buzzers. And it's like, oh, what is this going to do to my brain? So EMDR is about bilateral brain stimulation. And what that means is that the brain can process the trauma just as if the brain was processing trauma in the REM sleep. So, and this is a little bit creepy, but have you ever looked at someone who's sleeping while they're in their REM sleep? And if you notice underneath their eyelids, you can see their eyes going like back and forth like that. Okay, I have never personally seen that, but that is what I hear. So that's the example I use. So at that time in that REM sleep, that is processing the trauma, okay, or you're processing your day. And when something major happens or a big trauma, we don't necessarily have enough time to process all of that. Our bodies were not made to process that much stuff. So what EMDR does is it takes like the event, like if the event is a ball, and now there's all these little, like, I think of my dog like running through the grass and it gets all those like little pickers stuck on them, how they hate that. And then that is the original experience, and then all these little prickers are the emotion that are stuck to it. So it can be the depression, it can be some of that stimuli, it can be those threats, it can be the heightened response, it can be the hesitation, it can be, I believe the world is bad. It can be so many of these different things. And so what EMDR does by the bilateral brain stimulation, it starts to take those pickers off of the actual situation. The situation itself never goes away because we can't erase memory, but we can process through the leftover stuff. So that is the premise of EMDR. And so down here it says in non-intrusive, and that is what I really appreciate about EMDR, because I don't always need to know what the client has gone through. And in fact, if they don't want to tell me, I don't need to know, as long as we've gone through the safety protocols. Like, yes, they have good focus. They can focus. They have excellent coping skills, so that when they leave me, I'm confident that they can take care of themselves. So I've had a couple clients who I know bits and pieces, just enough to kind of keep it going for them, because all that processing is done inside the brain. So I'm happy to just kind of be that host to let that happen. And I think that lets the client keep their autonomy, right? Because trauma can be invasive. It can feel really invasive. And this is a way where you don't have to get quite so invasive. Let's see what's next. Let's see. So processing allows the breaking of old dysfunctional connections, and it links new adaptive associations and responses. So let's see, back to the example of the woman who was raped. Her associations, like all those little pickers she may have had, were really poor. And then that could have affected her job, because those associations are then drawn upon at the same time. So new associations can be installed in EMDR. So after the trauma is actually processed, the installation of something positive is done next. That is the last step to EMDR. So it's not, and that's a normal protocol. That's not something additional. That always happens in EMDR. The positive self installation happens at the end. So that I really appreciate that, because it kind of asks, who are you now, right? So it doesn't change your, this deep personality pathology, but it's a change. And so how am I happier because of this change? Just looking at the time. Okay, we'll move on. Prolonged exposure therapy. So each of these modalities that I'm talking about, they're similar in some way, because they take different ways to process trauma, just a little bit. So this was developed by Dr. Edna. So this is also very empirically supported. It is not quite as researched as EMDR, but it's definitely stands its ground. It has CBT to it. So prolonged exposure therapy says you cannot hold being relaxed and being stressed out or having this trauma response at the same time. Not possible. So that is where prolonged exposure therapy starts. It's a little bit controversial because it involves in vivo exposure and imaginal exposure. And so folks are like, oh, in vivo exposure. So that means that you go out into the community, into something that may cause the stimuli to spark up for you, right? So like, let's say the example of the woman who was raped, maybe she was raped in an alley by her favorite restaurant. The in vivo exposure says she's going to go back and take a walk by that alley. So this is done hierarchically. So it means that we work up to this, and oftentimes they would start with imaginal exposure. Maybe that's on it. Okay. Imaginal exposure, meaning that we're going to do this in the office first, and we're going to see how this works here in your head, and we're going to talk through it via talk therapy. So in prolonged exposure, there's nothing like necessarily like EMDR. We aren't holding any paddles, or there's no light bar or anything like that. So it's processing it like head on. And for some folks, this makes a lot of sense. Like problem, solution. Folks that are very concrete, got those black and white thinkers, prolonged exposure might be the thing for them. Especially if you find a lot of motivation. If someone comes in with this major motivation and they already have lots of coping skills, prolonged exposure might be right for them. And prolonged exposure therapy also asks, how can fear help us? So that's like, the fear, like, the kid puts their hand on the hot stove, now has fear of hot things. So that helps the kid in the future, right? So how can fear help us? Let's see. All right, so we'll move on to brain spotting. And then I'll give Cassie can talk, and then we can always circle back around to something if we have more time. So David Grand is the founder of Brain Spotting. So his kind of motto is clearing the trauma blockage via the visual field. So this is a fluid kind of therapy. There is no standard protocol like there is in EMDR. So I would say like EMDR is the most strict, and then we go to prolonged exposure therapy, and then brain spotting is like, we're going to see what happens, what comes up. I have found many folks that it's been beneficial for. I do not do brain spotting myself, but I do have colleagues that do. So this is kind of the order of operations for brain spotting. You start with relaxation. You identify, I'm not supposed to say place in the body where you feel the most distress. And then, do you ever find yourself like, so if I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about something, like how my eyes kind of naturally go up, like I'm thinking like that. So there's two ways that this can happen. The counselor can watch where that eyesight is going and remember that eyesight, that line of eyesight. And then they know that there's something right there. So when your eyes go that direction, that is connected to a thought process. So essentially that is how brain spotting kind of works. That's why they call it the brain spot, because you're looking for the spot somewhere. So this can be done by the counselor pointing out that spot, or it can be done by the client knowing where that spot is. So like, let's say they come in for their second session and they've already identified this spot. So next time the counselor would say, okay, this is where your focus is up here, or the client would just know that's where I automatically kind of look. Okay. So that's called the outside or the inside window. Outside would be the counselor, inside is the client. It helps them hone in on the feelings. So the brain spotting protocol is really about identifying that spot and then processing the experience through talk. So then you can start to bring in other like talk therapies for trauma as soon as that spot is recognized, because then processing can start to happen in different ways. But they're saying that there is a major connection between looking at that spot when thinking about the trauma, because then that will help resolve the trauma inside of your brain, because you have found where the trauma lives. Does that make sense? It's a little bit out there for me. It's not entirely my cup of tea, but again, this is lots of folks it's worked for. I mean, some people say that about EMDR. They're like, what, you want me to stare at a light and look back and forth? So, okay. And then brain spotting, anxiety, attachment concerns, substance abuse. There's also an EMDR protocol for that as well. Major depressive disorder. So it really does. It has a lot of different different things it can treat. And I should mention EMDR also has a migraine protocol. That just made me think of that. That can help as well. So it's not just entirely based on trauma. It's based on anything that can cause a trauma response. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and I will stop sharing. Does anybody have any questions quick, or should we move on? It's a lot in a really short amount of time. It's all you, Cassie.
It would help if I unmuted myself before I started talking, huh? All right, give me 1 second. All right, so everyone able to see my screen okay? Perfect. So Lydia did a great job just kind of setting the stage. So I'm just going to jump into the next two modalities that I will be talking about. So I'm going to be talking about TF-CBT and CPT. There's a lot of similarities between the two. I'm trained in TF-CBT, so that's where I'll probably focus a little bit more of my attention on, and then I'll draw the comparisons to CPT. So TF-CBT is a trauma therapy approach that was specifically developed for treating kids. It's about 30 years old. It was originally developed to as a treatment model for children who had experienced sexual abuse, but they found that it can be adapted to any trauma. Cohen, Manarino, Deblinger were the doctors who came up with this protocol, and they found that it's a therapy model that can be really easily adapted across cultures and languages. So it's a practice that is utilized literally across the world. A couple of years ago, they came out with an additional manual on special considerations on how to use this model when you're working with LGBTQ youth. And another way that we found this to be a really diverse or widely adapted model is that it can be used in pretty much any session, in any setting, residential, outpatient, individual setting, group settings. It can be used in a telehealth manner. I will put the caveat that that's by video, not by phone. And I think that's true to all the modalities that we're talking about. They do have a telehealth component, but it does need to be by video. And the reason for that is that we need to be able to pick up on the client's visual cues of distress. We're not able to pick that up by phone. So that's one of the, I guess, the positive things that we've been able to use these trauma models throughout the pandemic and all the telehealth we've been doing. TF-CBT is a really structured modality. It can take as few as 13 sessions and up to 24 sessions. Sometimes with individuals who have really complex trauma, it can take a little bit longer than the 24 sessions, but it's usually pretty much within that range. So one of the things that I'm looking for with individuals when I use TF-CBT is that this is specific to youth. So this is appropriate for individuals between the ages of 3 and 18. This is based on their chronological age, not their cognitive level of functioning. So if you have someone who's, say, 30 years old, but they function more at the 14, 15-year-old level, this still is an appropriate model. We're basing it off of what their birth certificate says their age is. Obviously, the person needs to have a trauma history, and because we're writing a narrative about the trauma, they need to have a memory of that traumatic event. Trauma symptoms need to be present. Having a PTSD diagnosis is not required, but we're definitely looking for, a substantial number of trauma symptoms for this to be a beneficial therapy model. And this last bullet point of having a caregiver involved, it isn't a hard, fast requirement, but I will say that it works a lot better when you have a caregiver involved in the treatment process. And I think that's true for pretty much any therapy model. TF-CBT really isn't appropriate for individuals who have a developmental disability or on the autism spectrum. This was something that was kind of contradictory to me. When I had gone through my training, the trainer said that you can use TF-CBT with this population. The creators of the model said no. Based on my experience, I would, I guess, err more towards what the original developers of the model suggested. And I'll kind of get why into the next slide when I go through the treatment process for this. Not appropriate if the person is suicidal, using substances, has really disruptive behavioral problems, or is psychotic. This isn't to say that it might eventually be an appropriate therapy model, but we really need to focus on getting them to a point of stability, and where in an area where they have some distress tolerance. So we might be focusing on just regular cognitive behavioral therapy. We might be focusing on DBT, behavioral models, things like that, to be able to manage some of those things before we get into TFCBT. Obviously, if there's no trauma history, or if they don't have a memory of the trauma, or if there's no trauma symptoms present, this obviously wouldn't be appropriate. Also, we'd be really cautious in using this if there's not a supportive caregiver, and what we call the witness. And I'll refer to what that witness is on the next slide. So this is what TFCBT looks like. We use the acronym PRACTICE to describe the different steps that we go through. It's broken into 3 phases. The first is very skill focused. The second is where we write the trauma narrative, which is probably what most people are familiar with when we talk about TFCBT. And the third part of it is integration and consolidation. Each of these phases is going to take about the same number of sessions. So we spend 5 sessions in stage 1, we're going to spend about 5 sessions in stage 2 and about 5 sessions in stage 3, give or take a session or 2. One of the important things about the model is that for each step, they need to show mastery of it before they move on to the next step. So when I'm working in phase 1, I'm starting with P, the psychoeducation, before we move on to relaxation. I'm not jumping around between everything. I'm kind of focusing step by step and moving up. So just to kind of briefly go through what each of these things mean. P is for psychoeducation and parenting. When I'm in phase 1, I do a lot of work with parents, not necessarily in session with the client. Sometimes I'll bring the parent in towards the end of the session, so that way the consumer can teach the parent what they learned. Sometimes I do it as a completely separate session. It really kind of depends on the family dynamic and the needs of the consumer. So in psychoeducation, we're really just focusing on getting them information on what trauma is, trauma responses, just general information about trauma. Once they show a basic mastery of that, we move on to relaxation skills, which is just developing some coping strategies that they can use throughout our therapy session as we talk about the events that occurred in their life. Once they can demonstrate that they can use these coping skills, we move on to affect modulation, which is basically, can you identify feelings? Can you differentiate between similar feelings? Can you express your feelings? Can you manage your feelings? And once they have mastery of that, we move on to cognitive coping, which is being able to identify how our thoughts, feelings, and our actions are all connected, and being able to identify thinking errors and how to challenge thinking errors. When I mentioned that this isn't the most appropriate for individuals with cognitive limitations or who are on autism spectrum, usually it's in the affect expression and the cognitive coping where they have difficulty mastering it. And if we don't have mastery, we can't move on to the next step. So this is where we might find that those individuals really struggle and that this isn't the most appropriate model for them. So this is the completion of phase 1. Once we have that, we move on to phase 2, which is the trauma narrative. And this is where we write not just about the trauma, but it's kind of autobiographical. This is something that is always done as part of the therapy session. This is never done as homework. And this is something that the client dictates to me and I write. So we talk about just kind of like an about me, their hobbies and interests. We write about the trauma, obviously, but before we write about the trauma, we also try to write about a positive event that kind of correlates with the trauma. So if the trauma was abuse from a parent, what's a positive that memory they have of the parent? Maybe that's mom taking them out for ice cream. Maybe that's a family vacation. Or if it's a car accident, what's a positive memory they have of being in the car? Maybe that's, carpool karaoke with their friends or going on a road trip with family. And then we get to writing about the actual event. And the reason why it's important for me as a therapist to be writing this while they dictate it is because I'm going to be pausing them periodically. A lot of times the client is going to talk about the what of what happened. First this, then this, then this. So as we go through that, I'm going to pause them and, okay, so when this happened, what were you thinking? Okay, what were you feeling then when this happened? And those are really important because it's not just the event that makes something traumatizing, but it's our perception of it. And those thoughts that they have and those feelings that they have as they were experiencing it are what make it traumatizing. So it's important that we include that. Once we've created the narrative, then we go back through and we look at any cognitive distortions that they have about the event, about the trauma. And we don't edit the trauma narrative, but we talk about those things. And I do Socratic questioning to try to get them to change the thinking, to question it, to try to change those thoughts into something more helpful or more adaptive. Once we have completed the narrative, or sorry, once we complete that, then we write the meaning making. So what have they now gained as a result of processing this trauma? That's phase 2. Then we move into phase 3. In vivo mastery, that's what Lydia was referring to when she was talking about the prolonged exposure. That's not going to be applicable to every single client. So if it's not, we would just kind of move past that and jump on to the next step, which is what we call the conjoint session. And this is where they share their narrative with that caregiver or the witness. The witness is an adult who has who they trust, who is in a place of emotional stability where they can be supportive about the event and they believe them about the event. And once we have then shared the narrative, we destroy it as basically kind of symbolic of moving on. And then the last step is enhancing future safety. So this is where we look at where the individual might be a little bit more at risk. We know that people who have experienced trauma are a little bit more at risk for future traumas, for other adversity. So what are some things that we can do to set them up for success? So this might be talking about internet safety. It might be talking about consent, healthy relationships, codependency, substance use, anything that we need to address to really ensure that the client can be successful moving forward. And then that's it for TFCBT. For some clients, this might be we're ready for discharge. For some, we just might focus or transition more into just traditional cognitive behavioral therapy to address other stressors or other mood concerns going on in their life. I'll quickly transition into cognitive processing therapy. I'm not going to spend as much time on this, but you'll see a lot of similarities between TFCBT and CBT. So this was developed shortly before TFCBT was, and again, the focus was really on trying to create a treatment model to help adult sexual abuse survivors. And similar to TFCBT, we found that this is an appropriate or can be adaptive to any trauma, not just sexual trauma. And is a really helpful tool specifically with veterans. So in 2006, they came out with a manual specific to using this treatment modality with military veterans. And just like TFCBT, it can be individual, group, residential, outpatient, pretty diverse in terms of its use. This is a little bit more concise in terms of its treatment. It's only about 12 sessions. In terms of the curriculum of it. Some therapists will have an introductory session and an end session or conclusion session. So it might be closer to 13 to 14 sessions, but the focus of the curriculum of it is 12 sessions. With CBT, there's a large component of homework outside of therapy. So therapy sessions are largely focused on introducing an application of new skills and then reflection of the homework. So individuals who really struggle to follow through on therapy homework are going to really struggle with this type of treatment model. So again, this is a therapy model that's going to be more geared towards adults as opposed to children. Similar to TFCBT, you need to have a clear memory of a traumatic event and have trauma symptoms. And similar to TFCBT, not appropriate if the individual is suicidal or psychotic. We really want to get some stabilization in that regard before we would implement this model. And also if no trauma history is present, no memory or no trauma symptoms, not appropriate. This can be used with individuals who have cognitive limitations, but we found that it can be a little bit difficult for individuals with TBIs just because of memory storage and memory recall. There's a huge emphasis on cognition, so those individuals tend to struggle a little bit with this, but can still be beneficial. So similar to TFCBT, it's broken into 3 phases. The big difference with CPT is there's more of an emphasis on cognitions, on the thought process that people have. So the first part of it is really developing awareness about the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs that the person has about the traumatic event. We use the ABC model. If you're not familiar with that, the A is for an activating event, the belief is for the belief that we have about that event, and the C is the consequence. So that might be a thought, that might be an action we take. And the purpose of that is to identify what they refer to as stuck points. So where does our thinking tend to get caught up? Where do we tend to fall into those thinking errors? And we're going to use those stuck points then as we move into phase 2. So as part 2, the client would develop their trauma. This would be something they would do as homework. This wouldn't be something they would do with the therapist. That's another big difference between that and TFCBT. And when we look at the narrative that they write about the trauma, that's where we're looking at the beliefs that they have and the stuck points within that. And we're using that Socratic questioning to try to challenge those beliefs and try to get those thoughts to be something a little bit more helpful, a little bit more adaptive. And then the third part of CPT is similar in a way to TFCBT, that enhancing future safety aspect. So how have my beliefs because of this event altered? How can I adapt those beliefs into how I see the world in a productive way? What are some things that I can do to help myself move forward? So very, very similar in a lot of ways to TFCBT, but a little bit more structured and more focused on the cognition aspect. All of these models that we talk about follow the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, what they call the consensus model for trauma treatment. So their ideal trauma treatment, regardless of if you use one of these models or if you're just using kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, that it really should focus on these 3 phases. The first, stabilization, improving their distress tolerance, getting them to a point where they can manage focusing on the trauma, whether that's through a visualization process, whether that's through a narrative process of talking about it. We need to get them to a point of stability. As you saw, some of these models incorporate some of that into the model. Some of that's something you do separately. Phase 2 is all about that reprocessing of the trauma. And then the phase 3 is all about kind of enhancing that resiliency moving forward, creating more adaptive responses in their life. So, and that's pretty much it for the treatment models that Lydia and I were talking about. Just kind of a reminder that not everybody responds to adversity the same way. All people have very unique experiences and are very different in how they respond to treatment modalities. So as we went through today's information, you probably had individuals come to mind that you can see benefiting from one model or another. We do want to caution you that recommendation really should be coming from the therapist. We talked a little bit about some of the things that we're looking for that would make somebody a good candidate or not a good candidate for a certain treatment model. So that might be very different than what you're assessing for in your roles. So keep in mind that what you have in terms of, or what you have in mind in terms of what you think would be a good fit for a client, they might not meet the criteria that we're looking for. It might not be the most appropriate. So keep in mind that when you're talking to clients, to try to refrain from suggesting certain treatment models, because that can almost create a barrier in a way to therapy. The clients can sometimes get kind of stuck that, well, this is the only thing that's going to work for me. So if it's determined that they're not appropriate for whatever someone had recommended, that can sometimes cause them not wanting to participate in therapy, or something that we need to process through as part of the therapy process before we dive into the trauma work. Also, as awesome as Lydia and I are, we are not certified trainers in either or in any of these treatment models. So that is something that you would need to do from a certified trainer. So please don't try to implement any of these treatment models at home. But if you are interested in learning more about how to get trained or where to look for, I would encourage you to check out this website. It has a full comprehensive list of all the different therapy models out there, some of the eligibility of what consumers are appropriate for it, and information on how to get trained. So would highly recommend that you check that out if that is something that you are interested in. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and then I'll open it up for questions that people have for either myself or for Lydia.
While we're waiting for people to think of their questions, I just want to reiterate what Cassie said there about leaving it up to a therapist to make a recommendation. I think that's really critical. It's also important to know that we have a very limited number of clinicians trained in these specific modalities in our community, unfortunately. I'm very hopeful that as time goes on, we'll have more, both within our agency and in partner agencies. But again, we don't want to set anybody up thinking that that's the only type of therapy that will be beneficial for them, because there are other options available as well. And if any therapist encounters something that's beyond their scope of practice, they will always be referring to somebody else who has the special training that might be needed, whether it's in our community or out. So does anybody have questions? It was a lot to absorb. Even I've heard these terms over the years and it's still a lot. So I really appreciate this initial exposure to some of these ideas for some of our folks, and some probably know more than others do, but I found it helpful. Any questions, comments from anybody? Okay. I believe we have moved our lunch and learns to every other month. So we are scheduled for our next lunch and learn on Monday, March 28th. If you want to mark your calendar, we are still working out details of what the topic will be. If anybody has suggested presenters or topics, we're always looking for ideas. And please help spread the word about the lunch and learns. So we do have 5 minutes left. We can stick around if anybody has questions. Otherwise, I think we're done with the presentation. So thanks again, Cassie and Lydia. I really appreciate it. Rebecca, thanks for doing all the logistics behind the scenes.
Yep. And if Cassie and Lydia, if you want to send, if you're willing to share and want to send the PowerPoint to me, I can create PDFs out of them, and which isn't hard. I just export it to a PDF file type and then include that with the video that because usually what I do on the Door County Parents website is I house our lunch and learn videos, and then I can put a link to the PDFs for the presentations.
Yeah, that sounds
All right.
good. I'll shoot you an email with it.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, thanks.